Welcome back to the Trailblazers Insider Podcast on Rip City Radio 620. I'm Sean Highkin, the author of the Rose Garden Report newsletter and the Trailblazers Insider for Rip City Radio. You can subscribe to the Rose Garden Report newsletter at rosegardenreport.com. Make sure you become a paid subscriber ahead of the start of the regular season next week. I got a lot of content coming there, and I will also be doing a lot more road travel with the team this year. When becoming a paid subscriber helps to fund that. If you pay for it, it gets put back into the coverage of the team, which I believe is the best that you're going to find anywhere. So make sure you're on that. The podcast you can get on the Rip City Radio YouTube page. So subscribe to that, as well as on Apple, Spotify, whatever you usually do as far as listening to podcasts. You can get it on all the usual platforms. This is the last podcast without a regular season to actually talk about. Early next week, we're going to do some predictions for the upcoming season and do something a little bit more forward looking ahead of opening night on Wednesday against the Minnesota Timberwolves. So that's going to be the next episode. But this is the last episode where we are going to be talking about games that don't actually count or matter in preseason. Blazers finished up their 4-game preseason slate last night in Salt Lake City with a loss to the Utah Jazz. They ended up going 1-3 in the preseason. They lost both of their games to the Warriors and then last night to the Jazz. Their one win came against Sacramento. As we all know, preseason win and loss results matter a whole lot and are definitely the thing to focus on. So, they're 1-3 in the preseason. I'm sure everybody's losing a whole lot of sleep about that. But there were some things to like, really a lot of things to like, as far as the way things went for them in preseason, both on the individual level with some of the player performances and just the way overall that the defense looked when they had all their guys on the floor. And, you saw a lot of carryover from a lot of what they were able to do the second half of last season. I thought that the small ball lineup that they tried at different points with Denny Avdia playing the 5 was interesting and effective, and that's something that I think you're going to see them go to a lot during the regular season, or at least in some matchups and some spurts. And then, I think all that stuff was kind of. I mean, there are some injury stuff to some injury things that complicated a little bit. Denny Avdia left the game last night with a back injury, just like back stiffness. I don't know if that's anything serious, but he left the second half of that game. Toumani Camara missed the last 2 games of the preseason with knee soreness. What Chauncey Billups said earlier this week when we asked him about it is that they were just being cautious with him, and if this was a regular season game, he probably could go. So, barring anything changing on that front, I would imagine that Camara will be available for opening night on Wednesday against Minnesota. So that leads to the question of what the starting lineup is going to look like against the Timberwolves on Wednesday night. And I don't know if there's really a clear answer to that, because you're kind of seeing, even, with Scoot Henderson out, and Scoot was, I think, going to be somebody that was in the mix for one of these starting spots, you're still looking at 6 guys that I think have a legitimate case for starting. Like, I think Drew Holiday's locked in at the 1. I think Donovan Clingan is locked in at the 5. And then you've got Shaedon Sharpe, Denny Avdia, Toumani Camara, and Jeremy Grant for those last 3 spots. Now, if Toumani isn't ready to go, if the knee is still bothering him, then that kind of answers that question. But as we saw in the preseason, Chauncey Billups had 3 different starting lineups in the 4 preseason games, and he kind of tried all the different combinations of those guys in the starting lineup. And I think multiple guys did enough to at least make the case that they should start. People wanted to see what Shaedon Sharpe, if this improvement that we had seen in training camp or had heard about was real. And I would say overall, he did a lot to make the case that he should be a starter. I think Jeremy Grant, who, people certainly have their opinions about, and people certainly had their opinions about his comments on Media Day about wanting to start, but he, I think, played very well overall in the preseason. He's been locked in defensively. I'm not really putting too much stock into him dropping 32 last night against the Jazz, because it was against the Jazz in a preseason game, so I'm not really basing too much on that, but I think he's had a pretty strong preseason. Denny Avdia, a little bit more up and down. He had, his turnover stuff from the first part of last season was reappearing a little bit, and he's talked about how, he's kind of getting back into shape and getting back acclimated because he was playing in Eurobasket in September while the rest of the team was all here playing pickup with each other. So, there's kind of all of this stuff, like all these variables, but Denny obviously was a very important player for them last season, and it would be a little bit of a surprise if he doesn't start, but he did come off the bench in the first preseason game, so it's at least something they're looking at. So I really have no idea where it's going to land by Wednesday, and I don't know if Chauncey Billups necessarily knows either. They've still got a little less than a week to go before the actual season. They've got a bunch of practices, I think, in the next few days, so I think all of that is going to get sorted out. I kind of wonder if it wouldn't make some sense to go with the Sharp, Kamara, Grant starting lineup and bring Danny off the bench, at least at the start of the season, because with Scoot Henderson out for the start of the year, having Danny in the second unit will do at least a little bit to help with the issues around, who's the second unit ball handler, or, who's the distributor. Like it's either that or you really entrust Blake Wesley and Caleb Love and guys like that with a lot of minutes, which, those guys both had pretty good preseasons, but, I don't know if those guys are really rotation players on a team that's trying to be competitive for the postseason as these guys are. So there's still a lot up in the air. Like, I don't think there's anybody in that group that is like, you have to start them or else, it's just a crazy decision not to start them. I think there's a lot of different ways that it could go, and I think a lot of guys made the case that they deserve consideration. I don't think anybody took themselves out of being in consideration for being a starter out of that group, and I think that's a good problem for them to have. So rather than try to predict, which way it's going to go, I'm going to kind of just sit back and see where it goes, because I think there's a few different ways you could make a case that it should go. So that's kind of the more big picture stuff. Other than that, obviously one of the big stories of training camp and preseason has been Young Hansen, who, very much was out of his depth in that first preseason game against the Warriors. Was much better in the second and third games, and then last night he really struggled again against Utah. He did hit one 3-pointer, but he fouled out in 15 minutes, and there was a clip on social media that kind of went viral of him, on the bench. Looked like he was crying. He was being comforted by Jeter, one of the player development coaches. That clip kind of blew up, and I was not in Salt Lake City, so I wasn't, I couldn't ask anybody about it, obviously, but my guy Victor Sun, who is one of the Chinese reporters that's based here in Portland now, he works for Tencent, had a tweet with some comments from Hansen about how, he just was getting emotional because he didn't feel like he played well. And, he wants to be great, and he wasn't happy that he fouled out. To me personally, you guys have to keep in mind that there is just so much coming at this kid at this age, and given the, all of the things that he's having to deal with right now, from, being in the NBA for the first time. That's a different level of competition, a different level of physicality than what he was playing against in the CBA. He still doesn't really know the language. There's still a lot of communication issues that, we've all talked about very much, and that he's been open about, that Chauncey's been open about. It's something that everybody's kind of still working through. Everybody's doing their best to get through it. And honestly, like, the other part of it is, I think that a lot of the fans in China have pretty realistic expectations for him. And based on who I've talked to, a lot of, the Chinese fans that I've met, a lot of the Chinese reporters that I've met and gotten to know over the last couple of weeks, I think everybody just kind of wants him to do well, but doesn't, have these crazy expectations that, oh, he's going to dominate right away, and if he doesn't, then it's a failure. But it's still 800 million people in his home country that are going to be watching him and following him, and that's a lot of pressure, and that's a lot that you have to live up to as a 20-year-old. Being in a new country in a language that you don't speak, with new teammates, and different level of competition, and it's just a lot. And it's a very human reaction where, if he feels like he isn't holding up his end, or he isn't playing well, or he is in his mind letting the team down by fouling out in this preseason game, I totally understand. I mean, just putting all that stuff together, that can be pretty overwhelming for the kid. So I think it's a perfectly, to me, that shows how much he cares and how much he wants to be great. And I think, you know, knowing what we know of him and his personality, like I think he's going to put in all the work he needs to put in to get to where he needs to get to. And I also think that based on people I've talked to in the organization, in the front office, on the coaching staff, they all, I think, have pretty reasonable and realistic expectations for him, too. They didn't draft him expecting him to come in and be the second coming of Nikola Jokic from day one, like, a lot of the hype, especially after Summer League. I don't think that's ever been an expectation within the organization. I think they knew, and Chauncey knew, that when you draft somebody in those circumstances, it's going to take some time. And we've seen flashes of it in the preseason, that Sacramento game, and then he had his moments in the second Warriors game where he made some plays and he looked really good. But there are going to be nights like that first game and the last game in his rookie season, and that's just going to be something that people are going to have to expect. And I mean, really, more importantly, it's something that I think Hansen is going to have to expect. And you get the sense that he has really high expectations for himself, and he's really hard on himself when he doesn't feel like he plays well. But I think overall that's a good thing, because that means he cares. So given all the circumstances, that's kind of where I land on that right now. A couple of other preseason observations. Jrue Holiday, perfect fit, totally plug and play. He's just, every time he's on the floor, he's doing positive, productive things. And he's, I don't know how much he's going to be able, like, they're going to have to manage his minutes and his, workload. Obviously, he's an older guy, and that'll be easier to do once Scoot comes back, whenever that is. But, you're seeing now why they prioritize bringing Jrue in. He just makes things run so much more smooth out on the court. So the early preseason returns of him are entirely positive, in my opinion. So that's kind of the overall preseason wrap up for me. A couple of other notes. One, I mean, this isn't quite, I mean, I know this is a Blazers podcast and not a WNBA podcast, but I wanted to mention, because there actually is a Blazers connection with both of these hires. The Portland Fire, the WNBA expansion team that's starting up next summer, announced this morning, on Friday morning, that Alex Sarama is going to be the franchise's first ever head coach. This had kind of, you may have seen this because the team accidentally posted on LinkedIn earlier this week that he was going to be the guy, which is, it's kind of tough. But I will say it's not as bad as when the Toronto Tempo had their name leaked because the WNBA league office accidentally added it to the drop-down menu on the website. So if that makes you feel better, like, it's not the worst WNBA expansion team leak of this year. But putting all of that aside, the Alex Sarama hire is interesting to me, and he does have a Portland connection because he was the Rip City Remix's director of player development in their first season. When the Blazers first got a G League team, they hired him. Most of his experience before that was in Europe at different stops, different levels, both at the youth development level and just kind of at, the NBA, he worked in the NBA league office in their NBA Academy program. But he does have a history and a working relationship with Vanya Chernovitz, the general manager that the Fire just brought in from the Golden State Valkyries. And it's a really interesting hire. It's, I've talked, I know him a little bit. I don't know him well, but I know him a little bit from when he was with the Remix. And I have talked to Blazers front office folks, and everybody that has worked with him is very, thinks very highly of him and thinks he's smart and thinks he's talented. And I'm really interested to see how it goes. It's certainly an unorthodox hire, but I tend to think that Vanya Chernovitz, based on her own track record and what I know of her, should, I think trusting her judgment is reasonable there. The other hire that they announced earlier this week that I think that kind of has an interesting Blazers connection is that earlier this week they hired Ashley Battle as their VP of basketball operations. So she's going to be Vanya's number 2 in the front office. And she played in the WNBA for a while, and then she worked for the Celtics in a few different roles. She was a scout. She was in their G League team's front office. So she's going to be part of the basketball operations department. Just one kind of cool thing about her, and a little bit of a Blazer connection, a Blazer front office connection even, is that she played at UConn back in the day with Asia Jones, a part of Joe Cronin's front office, a very important part of Joe Cronin's front office. She's the director of basketball strategy for the Blazers. So now, these two former UConn teammates now have, both jobs in the front offices of the Portland professional basketball team. So that's kind of cool. So, the fire stuff, I think we'll get more into as, whether it's on here or on other platforms. I understand that, even though there's going to be a lot of crossover interest between Blazers fans and Fire fans, it's not going to be 100% crossover, so I don't know how much I'm going to be talking about it on here, but I figured I would mention these two hires here just because, A, they're both pretty major hires, and because there's actual Blazers connections to both of them. So that all came down this week. And then one other thing I want to mention just going into opening week of the season is that this coming Monday at 3 p.m. Pacific time is the deadline for players from the 2022 draft class to agree to rookie scale extensions or not. And that obviously applies to Shaedon Sharpe, which has been a big talking point for the Blazers this offseason and since training camp has started. So we'll find out in about 72 hours whether that's going to happen or not, and we'll see if they end up coming to an agreement. Thought it was interesting the Sacramento Kings agreed to a 5-year $140 million deal with Keegan Murray earlier this week. That's roughly, we don't know exactly how that math breaks down year by year, but it's roughly $28 million a year. I think that's probably a little bit high for Shaedon Sharpe, depending on what, based on what he's shown so far in his career. But, I think he's more talented than Keegan Murray, but I think if you look at which of those two guys has actually done more in their career so far, I think the nod there goes to Keegan Murray. So I would kind of say if the Blazers gave Shaedon Sharpe that much money, I think it would be a little bit high, but not maybe egregiously so. But, I don't know where the two sides are at in terms of the exact dollar amounts that they're talking about, or who wants, or, whether how much he wants and how much the Blazers want to give him. And I could honestly see it going either way. I think that, with how restricted free agency went this summer for somebody like Jonathan Kuminga or Quentin Grimes or Cam Thomas, there's some, I think, merit to a player deciding, I'm just going to take the money that's put in front of me, even if maybe I could get more if I wait. But I could also see Shaedon being, after the preseason and training camp that he's had, if he doesn't like the offer that the Blazers want to give him, being like, you know what? No, I'm just going to bet on myself, and I'm going to hope that it pays off, and that, I really have a breakout and become an all-star this season, and then they have to pay me a lot more money, which, for the record, I think the Blazers would be happy to pay him market rate if he actually does become an all-star. I think they'd love to get him to sign early for a deal that could become a value contract later on. But if he actually is good enough to command that kind of money, then I don't think it's a bad thing for them to pay it to him. And I don't think they would think it's a bad thing. I've seen this happen in the past. Back when I used to cover the Bulls, Jimmy Butler was kind of in a similar spot. The Bulls made him an offer that I believe, it was 10 years ago, so I don't remember the exact numbers, but I believe they offered him 4 years, $48 million. Or which I think he believed was a lowball offer. And he was like, what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to bet on myself. And then he had a breakout year, became an all-star, and the Bulls happily gave him a max contract that summer because he'd earned it. So I could see the Shaedon thing going a few different ways, depending on which, where the dollar amount comes in, what the Blazers offer, what he's looking for, whether he and his agent and meet in the middle. I honestly think it's a coin flip right now, whether it happens or not. I wouldn't really be surprised either way, but that's going to be the next big thing to keep an eye on before the season actually starts next week. So we'll be back on the podcast next week with kind of more of a preview of the season, some predictions, some general thoughts going into the season, maybe some clarity by then on what the starting lineup is going to be. Again, make sure you're subscribed to rosegardenreport.com for all of my written content, and there's a lot more of that coming, and some travel and a lot of that type of stuff. And make sure you're subscribed to this podcast on the Rip City Radio YouTube page, and then wherever else you get podcasts, and check out the rest of our other shows on Rip City Radio. We, I think, have the most comprehensive coverage of the Trailblazers anywhere in the Portland markets. So we'll be back next week.